So you were you graduated from university and were an unemployable philosopher.
Yes,
Put it that way.
Indeed.
Tell us about that next stage before we gradually made our way into politics.
Okay. Well, I got to the end of my dissertation and had a moment, one of those 3 a.m. in the morning moments, going, "What the hell do I do with the rest of my life? I don't know." I was looking at perhaps joining the Army or the Navy. There was also this thing called a graduate development program for the Defence Department, which seemed to be a little more flexible, and I thought I'd apply for that. I ended up applying for that and was successful in that application. This is a civilian role, so there were about 50 of us taken in from across Australia, all starting in Canberra in the Defence Department at the same time. They'd rotate us through different parts of that department to basically test you out. And I started out in an in-house. I didn't start off with the most promising placement. I was in this out-of-the-way in-house publishing arm of the Defence Department that they wanted to commercialise. I probably lasted 6 weeks there, but then after that I found things probably more akin to my inclination and capability. So I had a role in programming the Defence Capability Program, which is basically all the defence sort of hardware acquisitions, but ended up in a place called the International Policy Division, where effectively I stayed more or less for the next 5 or 6 years, which is really about defence diplomacy in the Southeast Asian and Pacific regions and also beyond that, and that gave me opportunities to go overseas to interesting places.
And you went to Bougainville, of course, which left a lasting impression.
It did. So I was part of it was an ongoing UN-mandated peace monitoring mission. It was distinct from a peacekeeping role. It was monitoring a ceasefire between two fractious parties on Bougainville Island, which is, for people, it's sort of between Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And that for me was interesting on a number of levels. And it was interesting to me from the perspective of seeing how high policy actually translates on the ground. And for me it was a good lesson in policy development and rollout, because if it doesn't work practically, it doesn't matter how intellectually appealing it is or how rational it might sound, your policy objectives have to work on the ground. So what we were charged with doing was effectively going around to these ex-combatant parties and convincing them to hand in their weapons, their guns, through a process of trust and all the like. What we found doing this is that you actually legitimised these ex-combatants, and they were the groups that you wanted to delegitimise as much as you possibly could. So we started running into some obstacles about getting these guns in. When we actually turned to the people in Bougainville who had social and cultural authority, and I'm talking about the churches and the women's groups, we were able to leverage those cultural pressure points to affect a better outcome, if you like. And that for me was a good lesson in community engagement, as well as just being practical and adjusting your objectives to the circumstances.
And it probably left you well equipped for life in politics.
Probably it did. In fact, I learnt my politics in the Defence Department because I was, and not to be silly about this, I was a foot soldier in a bureaucratic war. It was a bureaucratic war between the Defence Department, between the Prime Minister's Department, between the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for supremacy on strategic and foreign policy setting. And I learnt my craft.
And of course, once one is in Canberra, it's very difficult to escape that sort of political...
Yeah.
The magnetism, I suppose, of Parliament.
Yeah.
And you ended up working for the Howard government.
I did.
Towards the end of its long reign.
I did, and in fact that was strange too, because two guys I worked with in the International Policy Division went on to work for Mark Latham during his 2004 election campaign, and they were Michael Kearney, who now runs the Australian Republican movement, and another guy, Philippe Allen. So I was in a company town in a way, Canberra. It was a highly charged sort of political environment. I was probably a bit of an outlier because my politics became increasingly conservative for my stay in Canberra, and I ended up actually moving back to Perth temporarily before I got a call from Amanda Vanstone one day, who asked me to join her team and be her border security advisor, and I really enjoyed that experience.